Legion has been out over 6 months now, and from my own experiences, and what I've heard from friends and fellow YouTubers alike, the expansion seems to be holding up as enjoyable, innovative, packed with content and with more on the horizon, at least from the PvE perspective. This really interests me, because part of the reason why a lot of people seem so happy with Legion is that it has so far corrected a lot of the mistakes made by Blizzard in Warlords of Draenor, according to the community. The further away from WoD we get, the more that expansion is becoming a meme, treated like a bad joke or an awkward memory that's brought up at a party and which secretly embarrasses and annoys the fuck out of you. But was it really that bad? Did the expansion suck so badly that it warrants the hate and mockery of the vast majority of the community? Well, in my opinion, yes it does. WoD was a terrible expansion, and not necessarily because it induced the kind of rage you'd find littering any video regarding Mr. Pandaria, but more because it was just so dull. With that being said, I thought I'd put this video together, taking a look back at 5 of the biggest issues I personally had with WoD, and 5 of the reasons why I believe it sucked, and was undoubtedly the worst expansion so far in World of Warcraft's history. I decided to make this video into a top 5, because otherwise it might just seem like me ranting about why I hated WoD, whereas I think that this might produce a structured and hopefully entertaining video. So without further ado, sit back, relax, chug a noggin fogger or two, and take a trip into the not so distant past as we look back at the top 5 reasons why Warlords of Draenor sucked. Number 5. Professions. I'm one of those people who has never really been able to get into the crafting aspect of WoW, which is quite strange when I think about it, because I love crafting in most games. Terraria, Ark, hell even Minecraft once upon a time, were games I enjoyed because there's something so fun about collecting ingredients and materials and learning how to combine them into something actually useful. Be it a mighty weapon or piece of armour, a vital potion, or a powerful enchantment. WoW has just never held that draw to me, honestly. Not that I haven't tried it. WoD was my opportunity to do just that. I was maining a prop warrior and was taking the idea of tanking in WoD very, very seriously.
He's an orc warrior. I played, disgrace as it is to say, I main tanked as a fucking Night Elf protection warrior throughout High Morn for like the first half of WoD. And I've got, my transmog's actually decent, but on an orc it looks terrible. I've got the Bulwark of Jizanoth, as you can see here, Ulduar sword. Do you remember when we got this? Remember when we did Ulduar? I remember that.
To that end, I wanted to be certain that the day my team stepped into the arena of Highmaul, I would not be found wanting. That meant a profession, blacksmithing to be precise, as I always had a fondness for crafting weapons and armour I could actually use. Picking up the Draenor smithing and mining guides was super easy, and I found myself pleasantly surprised. This was so fresh. Oh, to be young and innocent. Fast forward a few weeks and I was sat in my garrison, slowly adding a few more work orders to the forge and waiting days to finally accumulate those 100 true steel ingots I needed to forge one piece of armour. What was the problem? Every decent quality item you could smith required true steel ingots, which you made from combining true iron and blackrock ores. Not much of an issue, you might be thinking, given the abundance of both ore nodes throughout Draenor and the fact that those 2 mats were all you needed to make anything of use. Of course you would be wrong. Initially, there were only 2 ways of getting true steel ingots. You could craft them, or you could place work orders at the forge in your garrison, if you had chosen to build one in a small building slot. No problem then. You set away work orders, and in the meantime, when you're not busy grinding out gear from heroics or doing dailies, you can farm some true iron and blackrock ore. That way, guys like myself, who are really eager to invest into crafting and making some epic gear, could get ahead of most of the casual crafters who did just a bit on the side. But that was not to be. You see, both of these systems for generating true steel, the one item you desperately needed to craft anything useful at max level, were time locked. Let me explain. I mentioned earlier that you could craft true steel, and that's true, you could, but only once a day. Sure, the number of ingots you were able to forge increased with your skill level, but only to a certain extent. In combination with the time it took even with an upgraded and follower-manned forge to put out a true steel work order, you would at most be able to produce around 22 ingots a day. Oh, and did I mention you couldn't trade or sell them on the auction house? Yeah, they were soul-bound. It cost 100 true steel ingots to make a single piece of 640 eye level gear, and while sure the gear could be upgraded for another ridiculous amount, and 640 was nothing to scoff at prior to the opening of Highmaul, the limitations forced upon all crafters meant that at most you could craft a couple of pieces of gear, at most. None for your friends, unless you were spending 5 days at full capacity just to craft Danny Death Knight a pair of braces. And when they were made, there was a chance they didn't even carry the secondary stats you wanted, meaning you had to spend more mats on a shitty item which would re-roll them. Fuck that. It was a disaster for anyone interested in crafting. Every single profession functioned in much the same way, with a key region like True Steel as a necessity in crafting, but gated off by these pointless time locks. Maybe I can see what Blizzard was going for here. Something to ensure that people didn't just sit all day, every day, creating gear, flooding the auction house with pre-raid best in slot items. But don't you understand that there will always be people who actually enjoy doing that? People who enjoy the idea of being a master craftsman. Free agency is one of the core incentives of the MMO genre, and Blizzard even understood this in the past, with specific endgame paths smiths, leatherworkers and others could go down. Items like Dragon Strike and some of the pre-raid best in slot vanilla armors were crafted, and they didn't need to be gated off. The worst part of the failure, that was the crafting system of WoD, was that it was so damn lazy. If Blizzard wanted to keep people from farming all day long, they could have introduced something so much more immersive and akin to the older game and traditional RPGs. Bosses which drop mats and components or recipes, long quest chains to learn how to upgrade items, or some more customizable aspect to make you feel as though you were somewhat individual as a smith, alchemist or tailor. I haven't put this down in the script I'm reading from, but I went and did Molten Core a few days ago for some transmog gear, and I kept noticing all of these items that were dropping that were crafted mats. They were mats that you needed to use to craft items, and that system is so cool, it's so awesome, the idea that you would have another incentive to do something like raiding, or it could be PvP, or some other kind of content to get a really useful mat. Another example is how dark iron ore could only be smithed using a little forge right outside the entrance of Molten Core at the end of Blackrock Depths. That's awesome, seriously, and they need to bring stuff like that back, and WoD just fucked up so massively with the idea of crafting. But no, this was what they thought was best, you know, a gated system which worked the same way on every profession. By the time we got to level 3 mines and upgraded forges, you didn't even need to step outside of your garrison in order to farm the mats and learn the recipes to craft the best craftable items in the game. It was such a farce. On a more positive note, from my experience, the Legion system seems so much better than it was before. But after the bitter taste of WoD, I still haven't found the incentive to craft again. Maybe it's just me, or maybe it's just the way the game is designed. At least Blizz seems to have learned from their mistake. May we never have to think about True Steel grinders ever again. Ugh. Number 4. Apex's Crystals. For many players, this one might deserve a higher place on the list, but ironically, Apex's Crystals was such a boring snorefest that many of us stopped doing them as soon as we realised that grinding them was practically worthless and was saved from having to think about them. I mean, until Blizzard decided to make them the arbitrary catch-up mechanic later on in the expansion. But you know, I'll talk about the sacrilege that is Tanaan Jungle a little later on. I honestly have no idea what Blizzard was thinking here. What was the purpose in Apex's Crystals? To give players something to do? To get them out of their garrison? Oh, well, what a great solution. Send the entirety of the early expansion population of your server, which was a lot of people at the start of WoD, remember, to one of a few locations to complete an inconceivably dull and unimaginative bonus objective. Better still, give all of these players a daily quest from their garrison, which adds more Apexes for one of these bonus areas, so they're now all piled into one place, having to share the same mobs, items, and everything else in order to complete it. I mean, for fuck's sake, Blizz, I know Breaking Bad was massively popular during WoD development, but at least Heisenberg's crystals gave people a good high before it fucked their lives up. It was so dumb and so lazy, especially when considering the amazing catch-up mechanics and non-instance gearing mechanics Blizzard had implemented previously, both on the Isle of Kel'Danas and the Thunder Isle. Both were superior to the entire Apex's system and far more memorable, even though they were only important to one patch of their respective expansions. My least favourite Apex's wasteland was in the corner of the Spires of Iraq, bordering Shadowmoon Valley. I don't know the name of the place and I don't give a fuck. It's edged into my mind to such an extent that I'm considering suing Blizzard for psychological damages. What made this one so bad, you ask? Well, the easiest way to fill the objective completion meter was to free prisoners dotted around the clusterfuck of a questing area. How did you get the keys to free them, you ask? Well, certain mobs had a chance of dropping a key. Then you had to unlock the prisoner's shackles and run them back to a safety point, all the while being forced to compete with everyone else in the area. If you've done it before, you're already getting nightmares about the place I'm talking about. and just the memory of it makes me cringe. And it wasn't to end there. Tanaan Jungle was the long-awaited hidden zone of WoD. We'd seen it in the trailer, we'd arrived there in the beginning, and I personally had illegally snuck into the zone using an Aviana's Feather mid-high maul progression to report back to my guild that it was full of, well, fuck all. I was playing a warrior at the time, as I mentioned earlier, but maybe I'm a priest at heart, because those words were prophetic as fuck. When it was released, Tanaan was empty. That is to say, empty of anything worth doing. In terms of content, it was full of shit. Daily Apex's zones and rare mobs which dropped the aptly named baleful gear, a reflection of the community's response to the zone. I hated Tanaan. Hated it. Maybe I'm biased, but everything about it sucked for me. It looked like garbage, the Apex's quests were as terrible as they had always been, and for anyone who, like me, had foolishly decided to return to WoW patch 6.2, the Apex's quests were waiting, as there were no new 5-mans to gear up through. Interesting, isn't it? We came from the ICC and Endtime dungeons of Wrath and Kata, and the Magister's Terrace, one of the greatest dungeons ever in my opinion, all the way back in TBC, to this, a shitty daily mechanic in the ugliest zone of the expansion. The only reward I got out of Apex crystals throughout Warlords of Draenor was being geared enough from them that I never needed to look at those shitty blue crystals ever again. Good riddance. Number 3. Garrisons. Some people might put garrisons on their number 1 spot for this list, and others might not put them on at all. For me, garrisons represent the one feature I hated about WoD, but which I really didn't want to hate. I mean it. In the beginning, as I was leveling up and building my garrison, I loved it. It was something wholly new to the game, something to get excited over, a deliberate nod to the days of the Warcraft strategy games, and an answer to all those voices who had begged for player housing over the years. It could have been so great, which is why its monumental failure is so crushingly disappointing. On paper, the garrison sounded like a great idea, and I was hyped as anyone else for them. They were to add an element of individuality to your gaming experience, provide choices on which followers to recruit, what buildings to construct, and so on. However, very soon it became very clear that garrisons were to be the complete opposite of the fun, unique experience we'd hoped. What was the problem? Well, a few things. Firstly, the follower system was a joke, providing some conveniences for sure, such as bodyguards and work orders for crafting, but largely serving little more purpose than to automate your gameplay and actually discourage you from trying new content. You could actually get raid quality gear from garrison missions once you'd upgraded your followers sufficiently. Why? For what reason? The fun of raiding shouldn't be getting gear, it should be downing bosses with your mates for a fun and gripping challenge. What is the point in just giving away these items? There isn't one, there never was. The system just promoted boredom. Even more so when Tanaan Jungle arrived, along with the new naval shipyard, which was essentially a complete restart of your garrison, requiring you to get plans for new ships, upgrade them via random drops from missions, all the while juggling the fact that they could be destroyed on missions and required a brand new resource, oil, to do anything. Oh yeah, did I mention that there were only 2 ways of obtaining this oil? You guessed it, boring Tanaan dailies or garrison missions. So to put this in as simple terms as possible, you sent off your now redundant followers using garrison resources to complete missions which gave you oil, so you could send your boats off on new missions which gave you something you could have actually gotten from getting out into the world and playing the fucking game. You know, this sounds so ridiculous describing it now, and I can think of nothing that would turn a new player off more than this explanation. Who thought that this would be fun? The worst part of the garrison disaster for me was that it destroyed my reason for playing. Every time I logged on into my garrison, I just wanted to unsubscribe, and eventually I actually did. The only 2 things worth doing outside of your garrison were dailies and raids. Everything else you could automate, craft or queue for in the garrison, and let's be honest, Apex's crystals were just as dull as the garrison, and who wants to try and gear up for raiding? Who wants to find that energy and incentive when you log into Frostwall or Lunarfall every night, alone and guildless? On a positive note, the Legion Order Halls have almost completely solved the issues I have with garrisons. They have nothing to do with crafting, and there is literally no reason to stay there any longer than necessary other than to enjoy the company of your classmates or the Order Hall itself, which is fine. Visually, I don't like some of them, the warrior one especially, but that's just personal preference, and they all still look miles better than the Frostwall ever did. Garrisons are a thing of the past, and it's good to see that sometimes Blizzard can learn from its mistakes. Number 2. The content drought. Having long periods of the same content is a problem which WoW has suffered from at several points during the game's lifetime, and usually this leads to stagnation and a gradual stream of players leaving the game out of sheer boredom, either because there doesn't seem to be anything new and exciting to draw them in to log on, or because they might have completed everything available that they actually want to do in-game. Now we can all think of periods when WoW has suffered from a lack of fresh content, but for me, it was never worse than at the end of MoP and at the end of WoD, and WoD especially, not least due to the lack of content in general throughout the expansion. I came back to the release of Hellfire Citadel and patch 6.2 desperately hoping to get back into raiding and playing with new friends and a fresh team. You have to understand, I really wanted to give the game a chance. I did. I came back and quit no fewer than 3 times during patch 6.2 because all that was waiting for me when I logged in, besides my garrison, was Tanaan jungle dailies I'd done before, a grind via baleful drops and apexes, and the LFR, which spoiled the raid, the one thing I was interested in, before I even walked inside. When I did finally get inside Hellfire Citadel, I found it visually uninspired and less interesting than either High Maul or BRF, neither of which were particularly impressive, and it wasn't long before I quit yet again. There isn't much more to say about this, other than that for an expansion, which was planned to only last 18 months, and it's pretty depressing to think that 6.2 alone constituted over a year of Warlords of Draenor. I am honestly not at all surprised that so many players like myself took breaks or quit the game entirely during this period. I hope we don't see its like again. Number 1. Lazy design. Most, if not all, of the points made in this video, whilst bad enough on their own, came from this one: the lazy design philosophy behind the expansion. Warlords of Draenor is a key example of how a game's development and design philosophy can be simultaneously lazy and rushed. Do you remember how I mentioned earlier that WoD was only planned to last 18 months? Well, it's true. The idea was that after the long stagnation of the Siege of Orgrimmar at the end of Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard wanted to condense expansions so one was released every 18 months or so, rather than the usual 2 years or near enough that. Part of the way into development of WoD, they must have come to the realisation that banging out the expansion in that short a time frame was simply impossible, and they wouldn't have enough time to develop the next one. Unwilling and unable to stuff more content into the expansion, WoD was the result. Literally overflowing with obvious flaws and missing parts, accompanied by rushed and half-finished concepts and content. Just so it doesn't look like I'm theorising here, let me give you some clear examples from the game. Remember how good the Lords of War short films were? They were great, right? They really got me hyped for WoD, and I was certain that this expansion would be super modern and packed with a rich storyline. Kargath Bladefist was one of the key figures of that series, the first to be released if I remember correctly. If you look back at beta footage of the Kargath fight in High Maul, you'll see something quite interesting, and I invite you to find this out for yourself. Early footage showed that at the end of the fight, you cut off Kargath Bladefist's Bladefist, I'll try and say that 10 times fast, and after doing so, he ran out of the arena. He lived to fight another day. To do what then? I always liked the idea that Kargath would turn and eventually join us, but that was not to be. Perhaps it was intended that he would take the place of Kilrog Deadeye and end up being the warlord who turned to the Fel in 6.2. That kind of importance would be fitting for one of the most recognisable and notorious of the warlords. After all, Kargath had been the infamous last boss of the Shattered Halls, an unforgettable heroic set in the real Hellfire Citadel, a dungeon no one who actually ran it in the Burning Crusade could forget. Instead, on live when I killed Kargath, I was shocked and disappointed to see him lying dead on the sand, little more than the most basic of teamwork check fights. I later confirmed after downing the boss on heroic and mythic modes that this was not some hidden secret you only discovered with the harder difficulties. The story of Kargath had been cut short to fit this rushed window. Lazy. That's one example, but there are many, many more. How about the story? Brushing over how lame and unimaginative the premise of the expansion was, what about the "we all lived happily ever after" ending? Seriously? The Orcs were responsible for the death of Marad, alternate Valen, countless Draenei, and the genocide of the Arakoa, among other things. And as for the Draenei, well, alongside the Frostwolves, they obliterated the Iron Horde and took out every single warlord other than Grom. But you know, we did kill his son, so I'm sure he's cool with it all now. Orgrim Doomhammer, or Dumbhammer should I say. You know the guy whose name was the origin for the Horde capital city? The former war chief of the Horde and the original owner of the Doomhammer, the Horde's most famous weapon? Let's just give him a 20-minute slot in Talador, then have him killed off-screen and not even featured in the end zone cutscene. Akama, one of the most famous Draenei, gets a cameo quest and little more. Ner'zhul gets a dungeon, sure, but this is the original fucking Lich King we're talking about here. I get the point that there is only so much Blizzard could have fitted into an expansion they intended to be so short, but it wasn't short, it was rushed, and they missed out on so much in order to try to fulfill this impossible task. Now, I've talked a lot about the story of Warlords of Draenor, and I understand that there are a lot of you out there who don't give a fuck about the story of WoW, or really don't care too much about it. It's more about the gameplay and the mechanics for you. But it wasn't as if the laziness of this expansion didn't stretch to the gameplay. WoD was the first expansion in the history of World of Warcraft not to introduce either a new class, race, or both. Every single expansion that came before, and Legion which came after, introduced either a new class, or race, or both to the game. I mean, say what you want about the pandas, but at least it's something, rather than nothing. And it's not like Warlords of Draenor didn't have an abundance of cool races they could have introduced. Ogres, Arakoa, you know those races people have been wanting to play since forever? Nope. So now that we've concluded that WoD failed compared to every other expansion in its inability to introduce a new race or class, let's talk about the raiding. There were 3 raids in WoD compared to the usual 5. Highmaul I found quite interesting but nothing stellar, and BRF felt far too much like the latter stages of Siege of Orgrimmar to me personally. HFC I despised, not just because it looked like fel-infused dog shite visually, but also because of what I'd had to do to get into the fucking raid. The only part I liked the look of was Gorfien's area, and you were only there for the boss fight itself. I'm going to gloss over the fact that Karabor and Bladespire Citadel were potentially going to be Alliance and Horde cities, rather than the disgusting reality which was Ashran, because it's just conjecture. But all in all, I think it's clear that WoD was a rushed project with lazy attempts to shore up the cracks which were blaringly obvious to everyone who was so hyped for the new expansion. Do I blame Blizzard for wanting to try shorter, more condensed expansions? No. Do I conclude that the idea failed entirely and resulted in the worst expansion to date? Absolutely. So there we have it, guys, my personal top 5 reasons why Warlords of Draenor sucked. You know, when making this video I asked myself a question. Was there one thing which WoD introduced that I could categorically state was a great addition to the game? Every single other expansion has introduced some key feature which I think has improved the game dramatically, whether it was a new class like DKs or monks, or new races such as the Blood Elves which have become so popular. Even lesser features such as transmogging and cutscenes which refreshed the game's appeal. With WoD there is nothing of note I can think of to this effect. I love the cutscenes more than anything, but having just leveled again through Pandaland, I'm reminded that the use of regular cutscenes through leveling and end raids was not a new feature in Warlords. Ultimately, the one thing I can think of is bonus objectives, but only because they provide so much XP. Hardly a good reason to big up an expansion, is it? Rather, an apt way of explaining to new players just why WoD is rated so poorly. I hope you enjoyed this video, guys, and that you agree with most of my points. Even if you didn't, I hope you got a laugh out of it and enjoyed it nonetheless. One of the unique things about WoW is our ability to look back and laugh even at the shit times in the game, not just the great memories we've made. What were your top 5 reasons for thinking WoD sucked, or did you actually like it a lot? Let me know in the comments section, and please like this video and share it if you can. It's my biggest video to date, and I'd love it if you could get some support. Alright guys, thanks again for watching, have a great day, I'll see you later.